My name is Vanessa, and at 32, I never imagined my own father would ban me from our family's Christmas celebration. But that's exactly what happened. Growing up, my parents always favored my younger brother, Jake, and I had learned to accept being the overlooked child. But when Dad told me I couldn't come to Christmas this year because my presence might overshadow Jake and his new girlfriend, Laura, I snapped. It wasn't just the casual dismissal of my accomplishments, but the realization that for years, I had worked tirelessly to build a career on my own terms, only to be pushed aside for someone whose successes were trivial at best. I had carved out a path for myself, out of the spotlight, and away from my family's constant comparisons. The tech industry was where I flourished, quietly making my mark without their interference. But now, it was clear that nothing was ever going to change in my family. Jake, my younger brother by 4 years, had always been the golden child. Despite his mediocrity in almost everything, he was the one who got all the attention, the support, the praise. Growing up, I had been the overachiever, straight A's, debate championships, academic awards, but that was never enough for my parents. Jake could barely manage a passing grade, but every time he brought home a C+, there was a celebration, a pat on the back, a trip to the ice cream shop. Me, I had brought home perfect grades, topped my class, and yet my parents barely acknowledged my success. I remember coming home one day after winning first place in the National Debate Championship, only to find them watching Jake play video games on the couch. And it wasn't just the grades. Every milestone, every achievement I had, seemed to fade in comparison to Jake's mediocrity. I couldn't help but feel like I was constantly fighting for their attention, always feeling like I wasn't enough. But Jake, he had it all, the new car, the constant validation. He was their shining star, and I was just the shadow. It wasn't just academic achievements that set us apart. It was the way our parents treated us differently. Jake had a free pass. He never had to do chores while my list grew longer. My mother always explained that boys needed more time to find themselves, while I was expected to take care of everything. And my father, he would always say, "The world is harder for young men these days." I never understood why they couldn't see how unfair it was. By the time I was 16, I was cooking dinner 3 nights a week, while Jake, at 12, couldn't even make himself a sandwich. I took care of everything while Jake got off easy. It became clear that my achievements didn't matter. What mattered was Jake's potential, or at least the potential they believed he had. When it came time for college, things only got worse. Jake graduated with a 2.8 GPA, and my parents bought him a brand new Ford Mustang as a graduation gift. I had graduated as valedictorian 3 years earlier, and my gift? Luggage. For your journey ahead, my mother had said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The message was clear. Jake was meant to stay home, and I was meant to leave. As I got older, I came to terms with the fact that nothing would ever change. My career took me far from home, and the less I saw of them, the better I felt. I worked hard, studying late into the night and building my career from the ground up. The family, as I had known it, no longer existed for me. My success was my own, but deep down, I longed for the approval I'd never gotten. When I moved to Northwestern University for college, I knew my parents were only concerned with Jake. They never asked how I was doing, what I was achieving. They had already made up their minds about me. I worked 3 jobs to support myself, never asking them for a cent. They were busy saving for Jake's future, for his fraternity dues, for his every need, while I struggled to make ends meet. Graduating was bittersweet. They showed up, but only for the ceremony. The moment it was over, they left, rushing back to Jake's latest baseball game. My achievements never seemed to be enough, and I felt more invisible than ever. I had learned to rely on myself, but the lack of support still stung. My first job at Apex Innovation Technologies was a humble start, but I was determined to prove myself. I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing my health and personal life for the sake of the company, but my hard work paid off. I identified a critical inefficiency in the company's production pipeline that saved them millions. The recognition I received from that achievement was just the beginning. At 25, I became a team leader, and eventually, I earned a promotion to Director of Product Development at 27. The salary increase allowed me to move into my first condo, a place I was proud to call my own after years of living in cramped apartments. But even then, my parents didn't seem impressed. My mother's main concern was whether my demanding schedule was driving potential suitors away. Jake, on the other hand, was still struggling, hopping from job to job, and my parents continued to protect him from the consequences of his actions. But the turning point came when I was offered a vice president position at Zenith Enterprises, Apex's largest competitor. The position came with a life-changing salary and the opportunity to truly innovate. The position was mine to lose, and after months of grueling interviews, I was offered the role of CEO when the companies merged, making me one of the youngest CEOs in the industry. Despite my success, when I called my parents to share the news, their response was lukewarm at best. My father's first question, "Is it a startup or something?" The lack of interest in my achievements hurt, but I had long learned to move forward without their validation. I began to decline their invitations for weekend visits, citing work commitments. Our contact dwindled to monthly calls, and that was fine by me. I had built my own family of friends and colleagues who appreciated me for who I was, but that didn't prepare me for what happened next. The holiday season was always a complicated time for me. Despite all my achievements and the life I had carefully built for myself, there was always that lingering question, would I ever be enough for my parents? Every Christmas, I'd show up dutifully, bearing expensive gifts that were promptly forgotten. And every year, my parents would wax poetic about Jake's potential, his new plans, his latest job, his relationship, while I quietly sat in the corner, trying to blend in and not make waves. Last year, things were different. Jake had called our parents to announce some exciting news. He'd been seeing someone special, a woman named Laura. It wasn't a big deal, really. Jake had been in and out of relationships like most people go through socks. But this time, something was different. Laura was a professional, someone who had a real job. My mother was positively gushing about her. "She's amazing, Vanessa," my mom said breathlessly when she called to tell me the news. "She's a director at a major tech company, and she has her own office." Can you believe it? I smiled politely, my attention divided as I signed off on quarterly reports. "That's great, Mom. I look forward to meeting her at Christmas." The excitement in my mother's voice was palpable, and I could tell she saw Laura as a sign of Jake finally getting it together. The words stung, but I didn't let them show. Instead, I focused on preparing for the holiday, buying gifts, booking my flight, and bracing myself for the usual mix of awkward questions about my personal life. It wasn't until a week before Christmas that the call came. My father, usually a man of few words, sounded uncharacteristically nervous when he dialed. Something in his voice made me tense as I answered. "Vanessa, we need to talk about Christmas this year," he began. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him shuffling papers in the background. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my concern growing. Was there some family emergency I hadn't been told about? No, everything's fine," he said quickly. "It's just, well, Jake's bringing Laura this year and your mother and I think it might be better if you came for New Year's instead. It might be a bit awkward." I felt my heart skip a beat. "What, you're uninviting me?" "Well, not exactly," he stammered. "We just think it might be better. With Laura being in management and all, we don't want to make her feel uncomfortable. We think it'll be better for Jake if we give him his moment." I was speechless for a moment. The weight of his words sank in slowly, the cold realization that I wasn't welcome again. I don't understand. What do you mean, his moment?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, it's just that you're so successful, and we don't want Laura to feel overshadowed by you," he said, his voice trailing off in a way that made it clear he thought this was a reasonable request. It hit me hard. For all the years I had worked to achieve what I had, to prove myself worthy in their eyes, here I was being told to step aside for Jake, again. "I'll come for New Year's then," I said numbly, my voice betraying nothing. I hung up the phone and sat there, frozen. I had built this entire career, this life of independence, away from them, and yet, year after year, I kept coming back to a family that would never see me for who I was, but only as the backdrop to Jake's story. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had cracked. After all these years of bending over backward, always trying to win their approval, it was clear. Nothing would ever change. But something else shifted in me too, a growing resolve, a commitment to stop letting their favoritism define me. If they couldn't accept my success, then I would stop asking for their validation. I called my best friend Zoe that night, tears threatening to spill over. She listened to me vent, then with a calm voice said, "Vanessa, I'm sorry they're doing this to you, but it's their problem, not yours. You've got your own life, your own world, and it's beautiful. Let them keep living in their delusions. You've outgrown them." Her words hit me like a thunderclap. I had outgrown them. But what hurt the most was the idea that my parents could dismiss me so easily, even after everything I had accomplished. This wasn't just a holiday dispute, it was a lifetime of feeling less than, always in the shadow of my younger brother. And for the first time, I realized that I didn't have to live in that shadow anymore. Christmas came and went. I didn't attend the family gathering. Instead, I booked myself a spa retreat, something just for me. The gifts I had carefully picked out for my parents and Jake were sent with a note, but I didn't attend. On Christmas Day, I opened the gifts I had bought for myself: a beautiful leather journal, a pair of sapphire earrings. It wasn't the same as having my family's approval, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, it felt like enough. As the day passed, I found myself scrolling through social media as I had been avoiding it. My mother had posted a series of photos: Jake smiling beside Laura, her arm around his shoulders, the two of them clearly a power couple, as my mother had called them. The caption read, "Perfect Christmas with Jake and his amazing girlfriend Laura, so proud of these two power players." The sting was sharp but not unexpected. I closed the app, setting the phone aside, and focused on my spa treatment. I wasn't going to let this ruin my day. The hurt from that Christmas lingered for a while, but it wasn't the same. Something had shifted within me. I no longer craved their recognition. Instead, I started building a life that was mine without their expectations weighing me down. I was moving forward, and it felt liberating. But little did I know, this was just the beginning. The weeks following Christmas were a whirlwind. I threw myself into my work with a single-minded focus that I hadn't realized I was capable of. For the first time, I felt like I was living for me and not just trying to earn approval or seeking validation from my family. Every day, I found new depths of satisfaction in my job, and I was constantly reminded of how far I had come, even if my family refused to acknowledge it. But life, as it often does, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. It was a Tuesday morning in early March when I was sitting at my desk, going over the budget reports for the latest project I was leading, when I got the call from Jennifer, our HR director. She rarely ever called me directly unless it was important. "Vanessa, I need to speak with you about an urgent matter. We've received an application for the senior product manager position, and it's interesting," she said, her tone a bit too casual for my liking. "Interesting how?" I asked, already preparing myself for some candidate who didn't quite meet the standards. "Well, the qualifications are solid," Jennifer continued, "but there's something on the resume that you might want to know about. The candidate's name is Jacob Wilson." I froze, my heart skipped a beat. Jacob Wilson, Jake. I didn't need to see the resume to know who this was. But still, my hands trembled slightly as I reached for the document Jennifer sent over. Sure enough, there it was at the top of the page: Jacob Wilson, candidate for senior product manager. Jennifer went on to explain that Jake had worked at several companies in the last year, each position showing more responsibility in product marketing. His resume was solid, better than I had expected, to be honest. It didn't match the lazy, unmotivated kid I had grown up with. But there was one detail that made my stomach churn: a note about a potential conflict of interest. "Family connection to the CEO," Jennifer said. She sounded unsure of how to proceed. I could feel my pulse quicken. Was he aware that I was the CEO of the company? The thought of Jake in the same office as me, having no idea who I was, stirred up a mix of anger and confusion. How had he even ended up here? I was silent for a moment, then spoke. "Jennifer, you know the company's anti-nepotism policy, right? I can't be involved in this process." "Absolutely," Jennifer replied quickly. "But I think it's worth mentioning that he had no idea you were the CEO when he applied. He didn't even know which department you were in." This was starting to feel like a bizarre twist of fate. How could Jake have applied to the company where I worked, and how could he not have known I was the CEO? Was it a coincidence, or was there more to this? "All right," I said, collecting myself. "You proceed with the interview process as planned, but I will recuse myself from all discussions about this. If he reaches the final round, I'll disclose the relationship. We'll handle this with full transparency." As I ended the call, I sat back in my chair, staring at the resume. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. My brother, the one who had always been handed things without working for them, was now applying for a job at the very company I had built, and he had no idea who I was. Part of me wanted to be furious, to shut him out, but another part of me felt something different. I couldn't quite place it, but I felt a strange sense of responsibility for him. Maybe this was a chance for him to prove himself. For once, that night I barely slept. My mind raced with questions about what was happening. How would Jake react when he realized I was the one running this company? Would he be angry? Embarrassed? Would he even make it that far in the interview process? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. When Jennifer sent over the first round of interview feedback, I found myself feeling conflicted. Jake had done well in his interviews. He was articulate, seemed genuinely passionate, and surprisingly, he didn't mention me once. He focused on the job, not family connections. The feedback was positive, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. Despite everything, Jake was trying. Maybe he wasn't the hopeless case I had always thought him to be. By the time the final interview came around, I had made my decision. I would handle this professionally, the way I had handled everything else in my career. I wouldn't let my personal history with Jake cloud my judgment. The company's success was my responsibility, and I would treat him just like any other candidate. As the day of the final interview approached, I felt the weight of what was to come. I'd have to face Jake in a professional setting, and I wasn't sure how he would react. Would he be resentful of me for not helping him sooner, or would he try to use our relationship to get ahead? Friday afternoon arrived faster than I expected. I arrived at the boardroom first, arranging my notes and preparing myself for the meeting. The door opened at precisely 2:00 p.m., and there he was, Jake, in a well-tailored suit, looking confident as ever. But the second his eyes met mine, everything changed. He froze. "Vanessa," he stammered. His voice was filled with disbelief, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. This was the moment he would learn the truth about me, the truth I had kept hidden for so long. "Yes, Jake, I'm Vanessa Wilson, CEO of Nexus Zenith Technologies. Please have a seat," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. Jake blinked several times, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and finally, a dawning horror. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson," I said formally, maintaining a professional demeanor. "This is Diane Reeves, our Chief Marketing Officer. She'll be joining us for the interview." Diane extended her hand, and Jake shook it absently, still clearly rattled. He sat down, his body language stiff, his eyes never leaving my face. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I smiled tightly. "Let's proceed with the interview. We have 30 minutes scheduled, and I'd like to focus on your qualifications for the Senior Product Manager position." He nodded slowly, clearly trying to compose himself. The interview continued, but the tension was palpable. Jake tried to regain his earlier confidence, but it was clear he was thrown off balance. I didn't allow myself to get caught up in the emotional mess that was brewing between us. This was business. We wrapped up the interview as professionally as we could, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of tension. Jake was struggling. His responses were scattered, and he seemed to rely heavily on the connection to our family, something I had always warned him not to do. When the meeting ended, I stood and extended my hand. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wilson. HR will be in touch regarding the next steps." Jake stared at my outstretched hand, his expression a mixture of confusion and frustration. He hesitated, but eventually shook it. "Thank you," he said quietly, but there was a coldness to his words. As he left the room, I sat back in my chair, allowing myself a moment to process what had just happened. It was over for now, but I had a feeling this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. The following days felt like a whirlwind, but everything was oddly muted in comparison to the storm that was brewing in the back of my mind. Jake's application was still on the table, but I knew the inevitable was coming. The family would find out, and things would escalate. I had no idea just how quickly that would happen. It wasn't long before my phone buzzed early one Saturday morning. I groggily reached for it, expecting a work-related email, but instead, it was a text from Zoe. "Vanessa, I'm sorry, your parents know. Jake spilled everything, call me when you can. I sat up in bed, my heart sinking. The last thing I wanted was to deal with my family's drama over the weekend, but it seemed like I didn't have a choice. I dialed her number, my fingers trembling slightly. Zoe, what happened? Your parents, they're freaking out. Apparently Jake told them everything, and now they're calling you a traitor for not telling them you were CEO. They've already left several messages. I sighed, rubbing my temples. This was the fallout I had been dreading, but somehow I wasn't surprised. My parents had always been quick to dismiss my achievements, but they were also experts at creating a narrative where they were the victims. And now, Jake had provided them with all the ammunition they needed to shift the blame onto me. I can't believe he did this, I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. I don't think it was intentional, Zoe said, but your family, they'll take this and run with it, you know how they are. I was about to respond when my phone buzzed again, this time with multiple missed calls from my parents. I groaned inwardly, bracing myself for what was sure to be an emotional confrontation. I didn't know whether to answer or let them stew for a bit longer. You should probably take it. Vanessa, Zoe suggested. It's going to happen whether you're ready or not. Reluctantly, I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear. The voice of my mother came through immediately, high-pitched and frantic. Vanessa, why didn't you tell us? How long have you been keeping this from us? This is unbelievable. We raised you and you've been hiding this all this time. You didn't think we'd be proud of you? You didn't think we'd want to be a part of your success. My father's voice interrupted hers, sounding less emotional but just as harsh. Vanessa, we always knew you were doing well in your career, but CEO. You've really gone and kept this from us all these years. Your mother and I are disappointed. I exhaled sharply, struggling to maintain my composure. The anger was rising, but so was the familiar feeling of being diminished, of being made to feel like my accomplishments were somehow tainted because they hadn't been validated by them. But this time, I was prepared. Disappointed, really? I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. You think I kept this from you out of spite. You've never once shown any interest in what I do or how I do it. For years, I've been proving myself to you, and nothing was ever good enough. It wasn't until Jake's girlfriend, who, by the way, works in middle management, came into the picture that suddenly you care about my achievements. Let's be honest, you never cared. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence hanging heavy between us. You never needed us, my father muttered after a moment, a sharp edge to his voice. You were always so independent, you could have used us more, you know. Used you? I repeated, stunned by the absurdity of it all. You didn't even want to be used. You've always been more interested in Jake's potential than in my actual, real success. Well, we didn't know about all of this. We didn't know how big you'd gotten. My mother finally chimed in, her voice quieter now. It just feels like you've been living this life without us. You've built all this and we weren't there for it. I never had a choice, I responded, the weight of years of hurt and frustration pushing through. You were never there. You were too busy with Jake, giving him everything he needed while I worked 3 jobs and built my own future from the ground up. I didn't need your approval to succeed, but I sure as hell would have liked it. That's the difference. There was another long pause. I could hear the soft sounds of my parents muttering to each other in the background, but I had reached my limit. This conversation wasn't going anywhere productive, and I wasn't going to let them make me feel guilty for my success anymore. I think it's best if we don't continue this conversation right now, I said firmly. I've had enough for today, and I don't want to hear any more about Jake's feelings. We can talk later when we're all more rational. I hung up the phone before either of them could respond. The next few days were filled with the kind of chaos I had been anticipating. My parents left a string of increasingly dramatic messages. Most of them left me feeling cold and detached from the situation. My mother asked me to come to my senses, while my father wanted to understand why I was pushing them away. I didn't return their calls, but something shifted in me during this time. The anger and hurt that I had been carrying for so long was starting to dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I was no longer waiting for my family's approval. I was no longer trying to make them see me as worthy. It was painful but freeing. Meanwhile, Jake had remained mostly silent since our interview. He texted me a brief, generic birthday message, but it lacked any warmth or genuine connection. It felt like the last thread of hope I had been clinging to was unraveling in front of me. The day after I spoke to my parents, Jennifer from HR reached out again. The company had moved forward with Jake's application, and he had made it to the final round. But this time, I knew I needed to set some boundaries. "Jennifer," I began, speaking with cold professionalism, "I want to be clear that I will not be involved in the final decision-making process for my brother. I will not play favorites. He will be judged by the same standards as any other candidate." Jennifer hesitated, but she agreed. "Understood, Vanessa. We'll proceed with the standard protocol, and I'll make sure the board is aware of the situation." The conversation ended quickly, but I knew that this would be the most important decision Jake would ever make in his career. It was up to him to prove he could stand on his own. As the days went by, I kept my distance from the family drama, focusing instead on the work that mattered. But I couldn't help but feel the tension building. This wasn't just about Jake or me anymore. It was about the relationship between my family and me, one that had been fractured for so long and now seemed beyond repair. But in a strange way, I was okay with it. I didn't need them to approve of my success anymore, and I wasn't going to let their resentment hold me back. Weeks passed, but the tension never quite dissipated. My parents' calls continued to go unanswered, and Jake's application process at the company remained in limbo. I had made it clear to Jennifer that I wasn't going to be involved in any way, and she respected that, but I still couldn't help but feel like this was a moment of reckoning, not just for Jake, but for me too. I had thought that by cutting the ties, by stepping away from the cycle of hurt and disappointment, I would feel lighter. And for a while, I did. Work consumed me, more so than ever before. The company was expanding, and I was thrust into overseeing major projects that could push us to new heights. Every achievement felt like a small victory, like a piece of my life that was truly mine without the shadow of my family hanging over it. Yet, every time I had a moment of peace, my phone would buzz with another notification. Another missed call. Another text message from my parents asking why I was punishing them. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. They had spent my whole life making me feel like I had to earn my worth, and now they were demanding that I just forgive and forget. I had reached a point where I wasn't sure if I could keep pushing through this charade any longer. One Friday afternoon, I was at my desk, reviewing the final reports for a new product launch, when the door to my office opened. I looked up, half expecting a colleague or assistant, but instead, I found myself staring directly at Jake. He had come to the office. I froze, unsure of how to react. His face was drawn, but there was a look in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time, determination, but also fear. "Vanessa," he said, his voice almost sheepish. "Can we talk?" I wasn't sure whether I should be angry, relieved, or indifferent. After everything, here he was, the brother who had been the center of my parents' universe, standing in front of me, a small figure in the shadow of the career I had built. "Jake," I replied, my tone colder than I intended. "What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry," he said, and for a moment I saw sincerity in his eyes. "I needed to apologize for everything." I nodded slowly, unsure of how to feel. He had never apologized for anything before. It was always me who had to apologize to make the peace to accept their decisions, their treatment. I don't know what happened," Jake continued, his voice wavering. "I didn't think about how all this would affect you. I guess I just wanted a shot at something better. But I never considered how you felt all these years. I've been selfish." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had spent so many years trying to get through to him, trying to make him see the hurt that was constantly shoved aside. And now he was here, acknowledging it, but in a way that seemed almost too late. "I'm not sure what you expect from me, Jake," I said quietly, unable to mask the emotion in my voice. "I've spent years trying to make something of myself, trying to make them see me. And every time, it felt like you were their priority, that nothing I did was ever enough." Jake lowered his head, guilt washing over his face. "I know, and I'm sorry, I never realized how much I was taking for granted. You were always so strong, so independent, and I didn't even notice. I thought I was the one who needed help, but I never saw how much you needed it too." I stood up, walking toward the window. The city outside was as bustling as always, but inside, I felt still, quiet. It felt like the weight of my entire life was pressing down on me. "What do you want from me now, Jake?" I finally asked, turning to face him. "After all this time, after everything that's happened, what are you hoping for?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe just a chance to make things right. Maybe I'm hoping that you can help me. Not as my sister, but as the person who's built all this. The person I should have looked up to a long time ago." There was something raw in his voice, an honesty I wasn't used to hearing from him. It was as though he had finally seen what I had been trying to build all these years. "I can't fix everything, Jake," I said softly. "But if you want to do this, if you really want to prove that you've changed, then you have to do it for yourself. Not because you think you're supposed to live up to someone else's expectations. And you can't keep asking for help because you're afraid of failing. You have to want it for you." Jake nodded, a somber expression crossing his face. "I don't want to be like this anymore. I know I've screwed up. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try. I want to do things differently." For the first time, I saw the person I had once hoped Jake would become. It wasn't the perfect sibling I had longed for, but it was a start. "I'm not going to make it easy for you," I said firmly. "But I'll support you if you're serious. You have to prove to me, prove to yourself, that you're ready to stand on your own." "I will," he promised. There was a long silence between us as I processed what had just transpired. The air felt heavy with all the unsaid things between us, the years of neglect, the years of unspoken hurt. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Not just for Jake, but for both of us. "I've got work to do," I said finally, needing space to think. "We can talk later. But right now, you need to focus on proving your worth, not just to me, but to yourself." Jake gave a quiet nod and turned to leave. Before he stepped out of the door, he paused and looked back at me. "Thanks, Vanessa," he said, his voice sincere. "I mean it." I nodded, unsure of what the future would hold, but certain of one thing: this was a turning point. Whether it would lead to reconciliation or more conflict, I didn't know, but it was the first step towards something different. And that was enough for now. The days that followed Jake's visit were filled with a quiet intensity. I had offered him a chance to prove himself, but the pressure of that challenge weighed heavily on both of us. For the first time in our adult lives, we were no longer bound by the old, familiar roles. He was no longer the golden child, and I was no longer the overlooked daughter. We were two adults, standing on the precipice of a new kind of relationship. But that didn't mean everything was smooth sailing. Jake spent the next several weeks in limbo. He didn't show up at the office again, but I received periodic updates from Jennifer in HR. He had passed the initial stages of the interview process, though his performance in the final round was inconsistent. From what Jennifer told me, he struggled to hold his own during the case study section, and his responses to the technical questions seemed rushed. Yet, there was something different about the way Jake was approaching this opportunity. Gone was the old sense of entitlement, the expectation that everything would be handed to him. Instead, I saw a person who was trying to learn, trying to show up, trying to prove he could do this on his own. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that, in itself, was a victory. Still, as much as I wanted to believe in his transformation, I couldn't fully erase the skepticism that lingered. I had seen this cycle before. He would try for a while, show some initial effort, and then fall back into old patterns. Part of me wanted to protect myself from getting my hopes up, but another part of me couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, my parents continued to call. Every few days, another voicemail from my mother or father, pleading for me to call them back and talk things through. They hadn't grasped the depth of what had happened, or maybe they just didn't want to. The tone of their messages shifted between concern, confusion, and outright defensiveness. They couldn't seem to understand why I wasn't more open to their apologies, why I hadn't welcomed them back into my life with open arms. And yet, I still couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. Part of me felt justified in maintaining the distance. They had spent years rejecting me, dismissing my accomplishments, and favoring Jake. Why should I be the one to make the effort to repair things? But another part of me knew that the longer I avoided them, the harder it would be to bridge the gap. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the phone call I had been expecting finally came. It wasn't from my parents. It was from Jake. "Vanessa, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice unusually serious. I hadn't heard from him in a few days, so hearing his voice so heavy with tension caught me off guard. "What's going on, Jake?" I need your help. I didn't make it through the final round," he admitted. "I didn't get the job." I felt a strange mix of disappointment and sympathy. I had expected this. Jake was talented, but he wasn't ready for this level of responsibility. The weight of the job had become too much for him. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. But honestly, Jake, this doesn't mean you can't keep trying. You have the skills, you just need to put in the work. If you really want this, you'll learn from it and keep going. I know, he replied quietly. But it's not just that, it's what happened after the interview. I found out something that shook me. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. What do you mean? Jake hesitated. It's about Laura. After we broke up, she started telling people about how I had connections here. She made it sound like I only applied because of you, like I didn't even have a chance without you. I could feel my stomach nodding as the words sank in. Laura had painted a picture of Jake as someone who would only succeed through family connections, not through his own merit. And now Jake was doubting himself even more. Jake, listen to me, I said, my voice firm. You are not defined by anyone else's opinion of you. Not mine, not Laura's, not anyone else's. You have to build your own path. You can't keep using others as an excuse for your failures. You have to own your mistakes and you have to stand up for yourself. But you're not going to do that if you keep letting people's perceptions define you. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Jake's voice cracked slightly. I don't know if I can do that. I've never done it before. You're already doing it, I replied, my voice softening. You've taken the first step by admitting that you made a mistake. That's more than most people ever do. Jake was quiet for a moment. Thanks, Vanessa, he said quietly. I think I really needed to hear that. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Don't thank me yet. You have a long road ahead. But I believe in you, Jake. I always have. I just wish you could believe in yourself the way I believe in you. I'll try, he said, his voice filled with determination. That was the first real conversation I'd had with Jake where I didn't feel like the older sibling burdened with expectations. It felt different. Not perfect, but different. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel hope, not just for him, but for the possibility of our relationship growing into something new. That evening, I sat in my office, processing everything that had happened. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, not just in my career, but in my personal life as well. The path ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I could no longer live my life constantly trying to win the approval of people who had never truly understood me. Jake was on his own path now, and I had to let him take it. It was no longer my responsibility to carry him, but it was my choice to help when I could. And as for my parents, I knew the day would come when I would have to face them again, but for now, I needed space to build the life I had earned. I couldn't keep living in their shadow. Not anymore. The months following my conversation with Jake were a blur of work and self-discovery. I had made peace with the choices I had made, the boundaries I had set, and the relationship that was beginning to form with my brother. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for approval. I was living for myself. Jake, too, had made significant strides. He had enrolled in a new product marketing course, something that would help him build the skills he had lacked before. There was a shift in his demeanor, more mature, more driven. He had stopped making excuses for his failures and started owning them, which was something I had always hoped for him. Slowly, I began to see the person I had wished he would become, and while it wasn't always smooth, he was showing up. For once, I wasn't carrying the weight of his mistakes or my family's expectations. He was finally stepping up to the plate on his own. My parents, however, were still a different story. They continued to call, but the urgency in their messages had lessened over time. They were still trying to reestablish a connection, still holding on to their idea of how things should be. But I had come to realize something important. I didn't owe them an explanation. I had spent so much of my life trying to meet their standards, bending over backward to be seen by them. But I was no longer that person. I had my own life now, my own family, my friends, my colleagues, and the people who truly understood me and appreciated me for who I was. I had stopped seeking validation from my parents, and in doing so, I had found the freedom I had always longed for. It was around Thanksgiving that my father finally called again. This time, the message was different. Gone was the defensive tone, the attempt to guilt-trip me into giving them money. Instead, he spoke with a kind of weariness, a softness I hadn't heard in years. "Vanessa," he said, his voice low, "I think it's time we talked." I sat with the phone in my hand, unsure of how to proceed. After everything, was I ready to open that door again? I had spent so many years trying to get them to see me, to acknowledge the work I had done, and to stop favoring Jake. But now, I realized I didn't need them to see me for who I was. I already knew. and that was enough. I took a deep breath and called him back. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "What's going on?" "I've been thinking," he started, his words coming slowly, carefully. "We were wrong, Vanessa. Your mother and I, we should have done better. We should have seen your achievements, your struggles, your worth. We failed you in a lot of ways." My heart skipped a beat. It was the first time in my life I had heard those words from him. The acknowledgement of everything I had worked for, the recognition of my worth that had been absent for so long. "I know you're both proud of Jake, and I get it now," I said, my voice steady despite the rush of emotions. "But I need you to understand something. It wasn't just about getting your approval. It was about being seen, truly seen, and for years I wasn't." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he might hang up or worse, get defensive, but instead he spoke softly. "I understand, I do, and I want to try to do better, not just for you but for us." The words were simple, but they meant the world to me. They were the first steps toward healing, not just for me but for our entire family. "I can't fix everything, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give this a shot. But I need to do it on my terms. I've spent too long trying to live up to someone else's expectations." "Of course," he replied. "We understand. We just want to be part of your life, Vanessa. No strings attached." I smiled, a rare moment of warmth washing over me. "Then we can start with that." The following Christmas was a turning point. After months of estrangement, we agreed to spend the holiday together, but this time it was different. There were no gifts meant to impress, no grand gestures, just a quiet evening where we shared a meal, talked, and most importantly, listened to one another. Jake had his own story to tell, and for the first time, I listened without judgment. He had made mistakes, but so had I. We were both just trying to figure things out. I didn't need to hear my parents say they were proud of me. I didn't need them to constantly remind me of how much I had accomplished. I had already learned to be proud of myself, to know my worth without their approval. And that night, as we sat around the dinner table, the family dynamic shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were finally seeing each other for who we truly were, not who we thought we should be. The following year brought more changes. Jake continued to grow, both professionally and personally. He found a position that suited him, not because of my connections, but because of his own merits. My parents, too, began to understand the importance of balance, of seeing each of their children as individuals, not as competitors. As for me, I continued to thrive in my career. I no longer sought approval from anyone who didn't genuinely see me for who I was. I had learned that true success didn't come from the accolades of others, but from the inner peace that comes with accepting oneself. Jake and I even began to collaborate professionally, occasionally consulting on projects together, but this time, it wasn't about proving who was better. It was about mutual respect, about helping each other grow. It wasn't the sibling rivalry I had once feared. It was the beginning of a new kind of relationship. The holidays came and went, but they were no longer the source of tension they once were. My family, in its own awkward way, had begun to heal. There would be no more uninviting or second-class treatment, no more living in the shadow of someone else's success. I had carved my own path, and so had Jake. We were no longer the children we once were. We were adults, figuring out how to coexist, to help each other, and to accept the fact that we both had unique stories to tell. And finally, I realized I was enough. I didn't need them to see it. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. The journey had been long and difficult, but I had come to understand one simple truth. I had already earned my place in this world. And that was enough.